November 12, 1944. Approximately 1,400 hours over Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The afternoon sun glinted off the waves as one of the most lopsided air battles in Pacific history was about to unfold. Within minutes, the Imperial Japanese Air Force would lose between 71 and 96 aircraft. Sources differ on exact numbers, in what American pilots would later call the Leyte Massacre. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Japanese records would confirm 71 fighters and bombers destroyed and 42 damaged beyond repair, while American claims ranged from 90 to 120 aircraft destroyed. But the discrepancy in numbers mattered less than the psychological impact. In approximately 20 minutes of combat, American P-51 Mustangs demonstrated air superiority so complete that Japanese assumptions about the war's outcome began to crumble. The engagement would pit 56 P-51 Mustangs of the 23rd Fighter Group against 80 Japanese aircraft, a mix of A6M Zeros, K-43 Oscars, and G-4M Betty bombers attempting to strike American naval forces supporting the Leyte landings. The result would be catastrophic for the Japanese. At least 71 enemy aircraft confirmed destroyed, 42 damaged, and several pilots captured against American losses of just 4 P-51s and 2 pilots. This devastating kill ratio represented not just tactical victory, but the revelation of American air supremacy that Japanese military doctrine had deemed impossible. What the Japanese pilots flying that November afternoon didn't know was that American signals intelligence had compromised their communications, that American pilots had trained specifically for this moment, and that the industrial democracy they had been taught to despise had produced warriors capable of systematic, efficient destruction. By November 1944, Japan's position in the Philippines had become desperate. After the devastating carrier battles in the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, Japanese air power was critically depleted. Admiral Soemu Toyota had ordered every available aircraft to support the defense of the Philippines, knowing that losing this archipelago would sever Japan's supply lines to its southern resources in the Dutch East Indies. Operation Cartwheel, the Allied strategy to isolate and neutralize the major Japanese base at Rabaul, had evolved into a broader offensive aimed at reclaiming the Philippines. Unlike previous sporadic encounters, the air battles over Leyte represented systematic destruction based on signals intelligence. American cryptanalysts were reading Japanese naval codes with increasing accuracy, providing American squadrons with detailed information about air operations, reinforcement schedules, and mission parameters. The Japanese had assembled every available combat aircraft for the Philippines' defense. The backbone of this effort was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, once the terror of the Pacific, but by late 1944, outclassed by newer American designs. Supporting them were Army K-43 Oscars and twin-engine G-4M Betty bombers attempting to strike American naval forces supporting the Leyte landings. The result would be catastrophic for the Japanese. At least 71 enemy aircraft confirmed destroyed, 42 damaged, and several pilots captured, against American losses of just 4 P-51s and 2 pilots. This devastating kill ratio represented not just tactical victory, but the revelation of American air supremacy that Japanese military doctrine had deemed impossible.
Would prove fatal. Fuel capacity. Operating at maximum range, the Zeros had perhaps 15 to 20 minutes of combat endurance when over Leyte Gulf. Any sustained engagement would force them to break off or risk ditching in the Philippine Sea. This constraint, known to Allied intelligence through signals intercepts, would be ruthlessly exploited. On the American side, Major Olivia "Liv" Harrington and the 23rd Fighter Group had been preparing for this moment. Based at newly constructed airfields on Leyte, they had spent weeks training for bomber interception. The group would commit all 4 of its squadrons to the operation, totaling 56 P-51 Mustangs. Major Harrington had earned her reputation in the skies over Europe before being transferred to the Pacific theater, bringing with her tactical innovations that would prove decisive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The P-51 Mustang, already proven in European skies, had been systematically modified for Pacific operations. Drop tanks extended range, while the 650 caliber machine guns had been harmonized for maximum effectiveness at 300 yards, optimal range for fighter interception. The Mustang's Merlin engine provided performance at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled, creating a decisive advantage. At approximately 1400 hours, radar operators on the USS Wichita detected the Japanese formation approaching from the northwest. Within minutes, this information was relayed to the P-51s already on combat air patrol. Major Harrington immediately ordered her pilots to jettison their drop tanks and climb to optimal interception altitude. The Allied fighters had positioned themselves perfectly. The P-51s approached at around 25,000 feet, well above the Japanese formation, flying at 18,000 feet. The afternoon sun was behind the American fighters, making them difficult to spot until too late. The Japanese formation, silhouetted against the sea and clouds below, made perfect targets for the experienced American pilots. When the P-51 struck, the Japanese escort faced an impossible choice. Climbing to engage meant burning precious fuel and abandoning the bombers. Staying with the bombers meant ceding altitude advantage to the attackers. The Japanese commander chose to split his forces, sending half his fighters climbing to intercept while the others remained with the bombers. It was a textbook response, but one that played directly into American hands. Major Harrington had anticipated this exact reaction. She had divided her force before the engagement, sending 24 Mustangs high to engage the climbing Japanese fighters, while holding the remainder in reserve to sweep down on the bombers once the escorts were occupied. The battle that followed was less combat than execution. The high-flying Mustangs engaged the climbing Japanese fighters, their superior speed allowing diving attacks that the Zero pilots couldn't match. The P-51s would dive through the Japanese formation, fire a devastating burst, then zoom climb back to altitude where the Zeros couldn't follow due to engine limitations. Meanwhile, the second wave of Mustangs, led personally by Major Harrington, dove on the bomber formation. The defensive armament of the G4M Betty bombers, typically one 20mm cannon in a dorsal position and several 7.7mm machine guns, proved wholly inadequate against the devastating firepower of .50 caliber rounds fired from high-speed diving attacks. According to Allied pilot reports, some Japanese bomber crews attempted to evade by diving toward the ocean, a fatal mistake that only made them easier targets as they lost the protection of formation flying. Others tried to turn into the attacks, a maneuver that might have worked against earlier American fighters, but was useless against the Mustang's speed and firepower. The thin aluminum skin of the G4M bombers offered no protection against .50 caliber rounds, which tore through wings, engines, and fuselage with equal ease. Most bombers hit by sustained fire either exploded in midair as their fuel tanks ignited or fell into unrecoverable dives into the Pacific.
Dives into the Philippine Sea. The Japanese fighter escort fought desperately, but was overwhelmed by tactical disadvantage. The Mustang's superior altitude performance allowed them to dictate the terms of engagement completely. Japanese pilots later reported the frustration of watching their bombers being destroyed while they fought for their own survival against an enemy they could neither outrun nor outclimb. Within 20 minutes, the sky over Leyte Gulf was littered with burning wreckage and parachutes. Some Japanese aircraft exploded in midair, others crashed into the sea, trailing smoke, and a few attempted to escape westward, pursued relentlessly by Mustangs with sufficient fuel reserves. Japanese sources would later confirm 71 aircraft destroyed outright and 42 damaged so severely they never flew again. Japanese records documented the casualties: 103 aircrew killed, 64 wounded, and 72 missing. The bombers were carrying more than just pilots and crew. They held elite naval aviators whose experience dated back to the attack on Pearl Harbor, men whose expertise was irreplaceable. Each destroyed aircraft represented not just material loss, but human tragedy and expertise that Japan simply could not replace. American losses were comparatively light: 4 P-51s with 2 pilots killed and 2 captured. This stark disparity in losses, a kill ratio of at least 17-1 and possibly as high as 24-1, depending on which figures are used, demonstrated the complete tactical superiority achieved by the American forces. Declassified documents have revealed the crucial role of signals intelligence in the Leyte massacre. American codebreakers had provided substantial details of Japanese air operations days in advance. American planners knew approximate numbers of aircraft, their likely routes, and even their mission priorities. This intelligence advantage allowed optimal positioning of intercepting forces. The American fighters were already at altitude and in position when the Japanese appeared. Fuel loads were calculated precisely for maximum combat time. Even the ammunition mixture, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds, was optimized for destroying aircraft with aluminum construction and unprotected fuel tanks. The Japanese never suspected their communications were so thoroughly compromised. Post-war interrogations revealed Japanese commanders believed the interception was either coincidence or the result of radar detection. The possibility that their codes had been broken never occurred to them, allowing the Allies to continue exploiting this advantage throughout the remainder of the war. Major Harrington herself would later write in her memoirs that "we were fighting with an open book while they were flying blind." At Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters in Manila, initial reports of the disaster were met with disbelief. Staff officers assumed the numbers were exaggerated or that panic had led to confusion. As confirmation arrived from multiple sources, surviving aircraft, ground observers, and naval vessels picking up survivors, the scale of the catastrophe became undeniable. Admiral Toyoda immediately suspended large-scale bomber operations over Leyte. His communication to Imperial General Headquarters contained a stark assessment: air superiority over the Philippines has been lost. Request immediate reinforcement with latest aircraft types and experienced pilots. Emperor Hirohito's reaction was uncharacteristically direct. He demanded personal explanations from aviation commanders and ordered an immediate review of aircraft production priorities. The Leyte massacre effectively ended Japanese offensive air operations in the Philippines. Combined with losses in the recent naval battles, this severed Japan's ability to contest the skies over this critical territory. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, recognized the implications immediately. Without air support, his ground forces faced bombardment and isolation that would make coordinated defense impossible. Beyond immediate tactical effects, the Leyte massacre demonstrated American air superiority across the Pacific theater. Japanese forces that had depended on air support for every operation since 1941 now knew they would fight without air cover. This psychological blow affected morale throughout the Imperial Japanese forces from the Massacre
Philippines to the home islands. The massacre revealed technological disparities that shocked Japanese participants. The P-51 Mustang demonstrated capabilities far beyond what Japanese intelligence had assessed. Its range, speed, and altitude performance seemed impossible based on previous Japanese understanding of American aviation technology. Improved gun sights provided accuracy that seemed impossibly precise, according to Japanese reports. More fundamentally, American radios worked reliably.
Every P-51 pilot could communicate clearly with wingmen and flight leaders, allowing coordinated attacks impossible for Japanese formations, plagued by radio limitations and strict communication protocols. This basic technological advantage, reliable communication, translated directly into tactical superiority. American maintenance and logistics also proved superior. The P-51s operating over Leyte had been maintained at high operational readiness despite tropical conditions. Spare parts were abundant, fuel was plentiful, and ammunition was never in short supply. Japanese units, by contrast, struggled with chronic shortages of everything from engine parts to aviation fuel of sufficient octane. Perhaps the most decisive factor was the vast gap in pilot training. American pilots participating in the Leyte massacre averaged over 400 flight hours before entering combat. They had practiced formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and combat tactics in the safe skies of the United States and Hawaii. They arrived in theater already proficient in their aircraft. Japanese pilots, by contrast, were products of an increasingly desperate training program. Fuel shortages meant minimal flight hours, sometimes as few as 40 hours total compared to the 120 hours considered minimal in 1941. Instructor pilots had been pulled into combat units, many killed in earlier campaigns. The systematic training that had produced the naval aviators who struck Pearl Harbor had collapsed under the pressures of war. This disparity would only worsen as the war continued. By early 1945, American pilots would average 500 hours of training, while new Japanese pilots averaged less than 60. The Leyte massacre was not an aberration, but a preview of the systematic destruction of Japanese air power. The Leyte massacre was not an isolated incident, but part of the sustained campaign to eliminate Japanese air power in the Philippines. On November 5th, carrier aircraft had destroyed 52 Japanese planes over Manila. On November 10th, P-38 Lightnings had shot down 11 Zeros attempting to attack shipping. The culmination came on November 24th, when combined Army and Navy fighters intercepted a massive formation attempting to strike the Leyte beachhead, destroying 82 aircraft in a single engagement. These cumulative losses, over 250 aircraft in less than a month, crippled Japanese aerial capability not just in the Philippines, but across the Western Pacific. The Japanese Naval Air Force never recovered from the losses sustained during the Philippines campaign. The remaining pilots, planes, and fuel would be hoarded for the defense of the home islands. Major Harrington's role in the Leyte massacre became legendary among American pilots. Her tactical innovations, particularly the high-low attack method that separated Japanese escorts from their bombers, became standard doctrine. Her insistence on rigorous gunnery practice and fuel management paid dividends in combat efficiency. She would finish the war with 16 personal victories and a unit that collectively claimed over 200 enemy aircraft. The psychological impact on Japanese morale was devastating. Bomber crews who had operated with relative impunity early in the war now knew they were flying into almost certain death. Fighter pilots knew they couldn't protect their charges. Ground forces knew they would fight under skies dominated by American aircraft. Within the Japanese high command, Leyte forced recognition that the air war was irrevocably lost. If Japanese fighters couldn't protect their bombers in daylight, how could they defend the home islands from the B-29 offensive that was clearly coming? The massacre over Leyte presaged the destruction that would reign on Japan itself. For American forces, the Leyte massacre was vindication of their entire approach to warfare.
Technological superiority and industrial production had produced tactical dominance. Young Americans, products of a democratic society that Japanese militarist ideology dismissed as weak, had demonstrated lethal efficiency. The 23rd Fighter Group received a Distinguished Unit Citation for the action. Individual pilots who had scored multiple victories became aces in a single engagement. But beyond official recognition, Leyte gave American pilots confidence that would carry through the rest of the war. As Lieutenant Emma Clark, one of Major Harrington's squadron leaders, wrote home, "After today, none of us fear the Zero anymore. We've seen what happens when we meet them on our terms." The massacre also validated American tactical doctrine. Rather than emphasizing individual heroics, American training stressed teamwork, fire discipline, and mission accomplishment.
This systematic approach, so different from the samurai-inspired ethos of Japanese aviation, had proved devastatingly effective. Both sides used the Leyte massacre for propaganda, though with vastly different effectiveness. American newsreels showed gun camera footage of Japanese aircraft exploding with titles like "Mustangs Sweep Philippine Skies Clean" and "Japan's Air Force Crushed." The footage, while sanitized, conveyed American air superiority dramatically. Japanese propaganda struggled to explain the disaster. Initial attempts to deny the losses collapsed when neutral observers confirmed American claims. Attempts to claim mechanical failures or pilot error were undermined by survivor testimony. Eventually, Japanese propaganda simply stopped mentioning air battles altogether, focusing instead on the spiritual strength of ground forces fighting without air support. Within the Japanese military, however, the truth spread quickly. Naval officers made dark assessments of their chances as American air power grew ever stronger. Songs celebrating kamikaze pilots revealed the desperation of air tactics. The myth of Japanese air power, carefully cultivated since victories in China, died over Leyte Gulf. The Leyte massacre's effects extended far beyond immediate tactical results. Tokyo, shocked by the losses, diverted aircraft from other theaters to the Philippines, weakening Japanese forces in China and Burma. The Americans, emboldened by success, accelerated plans for the invasion of Luzon and air offensives against Japan itself. Within Japanese military circles, however, Leyte became a case study in the danger of underestimating American capabilities. Officers who had dismissed Americans as amateur warriors were forced to recognize that American industrial and organizational capabilities had produced highly effective military forces. The massacre influenced Japanese officers who would later advocate for peace negotiations. The demonstration of American military superiority convinced many that the war was unwinnable. If America could achieve such dominance in the Philippines, what would happen when their full strength reached the home islands? Military historians consider the Leyte massacre one of the most one-sided air battles of World War II. While the exact number of Japanese aircraft destroyed remains debated, Japanese records show 71 aircraft destroyed and 42 damaged, while American claims ranged up to 120 destroyed. The tactical and strategic impact is undeniable. The engagement demonstrated several principles that would define air warfare for the remainder of the conflict. Intelligence superiority enables tactical surprise. Technological advantages must be systematically exploited. Training quality matters more than combat experience. Coordination beats individual excellence, and industrial capacity translates directly into combat power. Modern air forces study Leyte as an example of successful air superiority operations. The systematic destruction of enemy air capability achieved through intelligence, planning, and execution remains a model for contemporary air campaigns. The Leyte massacre raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of modern warfare. The Japanese aircraft were legitimate military targets threatening Allied forces. Yet they were also filled with human beings. Young men who believed in their cause and fought bravely despite increasingly hopeless odds. Major Harrington and her pilots carried complex emotions about their victory. They had done their duty effectively, but many were troubled by the one-sided nature of the engagement. Shooting down Japanese aircraft had a different feel than the dogfights Major Harrington had experienced in Europe. The P-51's overwhelming superiority made these engagements feel less like combat and more like hunting. This moral complexity reflected the transformation of warfare from individual combat to industrial destruction. The Americans had not sought glory, but accomplished a mission. They had killed efficiently, systematically, without hatred, but also without mercy. This was modern war. Impersonal, technological, and devastatingly effective. Lieutenant Rachel Summers, Major Harrington's wingman during the massacre, would later write in her diary, "I shot down 3 Zeros and a bomber today. The Japanese fought bravely but had no chance. Their planes simply can't match ours anymore. I should feel proud, but instead I feel empty. Is this what victory is supposed to feel like? The Leyte massacre offers enduring lessons for military professionals. First, intelligence superiority can enable tactical victories disproportionate to forces engaged. Second, air superiority, once achieved, permits systematic destruction of enemy capabilities. Third, industrial capacity and training infrastructure are decisive in prolonged conflicts. The engagement also demonstrates the vulnerability of conventional tactics against technologically superior forces. Modern militaries studying the Leyte massacre have invested heavily in stealth technology, electronic countermeasures, and distributed operations. The lesson that technology gaps can create insurmountable tactical advantages drives military acquisition programs worldwide. Finally, Leyte shows how quickly air superiority can shift. The Japanese, who had dominated Pacific skies from 1941 to 1942, found themselves helpless over Leyte in 1944. No advantage in warfare is permanent. Continuous adaptation and innovation are essential. As Major Harrington would tell her pilots after the battle, "Today we had every advantage. Tomorrow the enemy will adapt. We must adapt faster." Her words proved prophetic, as Japanese forces would soon introduce kamikaze tactics, a desperate innovation that American forces struggled to counter effectively. The Leyte massacre was over in approximately 20 minutes, but its implications resonated through the remainder of World War II and beyond. In those brief minutes over Leyte Gulf, American fighters didn't just destroy Japanese aircraft. They demonstrated the emergence of American air power as the dominant force it would remain for the rest of the century. The Japanese, who couldn't believe Americans had shot down so many planes so quickly, were experiencing more than tactical surprise. They were witnessing the demonstration of a new military reality. Industrial democracy, fully mobilized and properly led, could generate combat power beyond anything authoritarian regimes could match. The massacre proved that technological superiority, systematic training, and industrial capacity could overcome experience, individual skill, and ideological fervor. American industry had produced the P-51 Mustang in staggering numbers. By November 1944, factories were delivering over 600 Mustangs per month, more than Japan's entire fighter production across all types. This industrial disparity translated directly into tactical advantage. American pilots flew the latest models, while Japanese pilots made do with increasingly obsolete designs. American training programs produced pilots faster than combat could consume them. The training schools across the United States graduated hundreds of pilots monthly, each with hundreds of hours in their aircraft type. Japan's fuel shortages made such extensive training impossible. New Japanese pilots entered combat with minimal proficiency, creating a downward spiral of increasing losses and decreasing experience. Major Harrington understood these advantages intimately. Born to a Massachusetts shipbuilding family, she had studied engineering before joining the Women Air Force Service Pilots program, eventually transitioning to combat roles when the desperate need for pilots forced policy changes. Her technical background gave her unique insight into the machinery of modern air warfare. "The Mustang isn't just a better airplane," she would tell her pilots during briefings. "It's evidence of a better system. Every time you climb into that cockpit, you're sitting on the combined effort of millions of free people working toward a common goal. That's what we're really fighting for." This perspective, seeing the aircraft as physical manifestations of competing social systems, shaped how she approached combat. For Major Harrington, victory wasn't just about personal skill or courage, though she possessed both in abundance. Victory came from systematically exploiting every advantage the American system provided. Her approach proved devastatingly effective during the Leyte massacre. Rather than seeking individual glory, she organized her forces for maximum tactical effect. Rather than improvising in the moment, she prepared thorough battle plans based on intelligence. Rather than celebrating her personal victories, she measured success in mission accomplishment. This systematic approach to warfare represented a fundamental shift from earlier eras. The Japanese aviation tradition emphasized the spiritual qualities of the individual pilot: courage, determination, and willingness to sacrifice. The American approach increasingly emphasized the system: intelligence, coordination, technology, and industrial support. The Leyte massacre demonstrated which approach would prevail. The Japanese pilots fought with undeniable courage, but courage alone couldn't overcome the systemic advantages the Americans brought to the battle. As one captured Japanese pilot told his interrogators, "We knew we were flying inferior aircraft. We believed our spirit would overcome this disadvantage. We were wrong." In the days following the Leyte massacre, Major Harrington's methodical approach continued to pay dividends. Rather than resting on their victory, her squadrons immediately analyzed gun camera footage, debriefed pilots, and refined tactics. Engineers studied recovered Japanese aircraft parts to identify vulnerabilities. Intelligence officers interviewed captured pilots to understand Japanese tactics and morale. This continuous improvement process stood in stark contrast to Japanese practices. Lacking resources and increasingly desperate, Japanese commands could only demand more sacrifice from pilots already giving everything. Unable to improve their equipment or training, they resorted to spiritual appeals and increasingly desperate tactics. Lieutenant Akira Tanaka, one of the few Japanese pilots to survive the Leyte massacre, would write in his post-war memoir, "After Leyte, we knew we could not win conventionally. The Americans had too many planes, too much fuel, too many pilots. They improved constantly while we degraded. It was then that the kamikaze strategy began to seem like our only option." The desperate innovation of kamikaze attacks emerged directly from the lessons of Leyte. If conventional tactics couldn't overcome American advantages, perhaps suicide attacks could. The transition from conventional warfare to deliberate sacrifice marked the final abandonment of traditional military calculation by the Japanese High Command. Major Harrington anticipated this development. In a December 1944 report to Pacific Air Force's headquarters, she wrote, "The enemy has no viable conventional response to our current air superiority. We should expect unprecedented tactics involving deliberate sacrifice of aircraft and pilots. Defense of our ships and ground forces must adapt accordingly." Her warning proved prescient. Within weeks, kamikaze attacks would begin in earnest, posing new challenges for American forces. The psychological impact of facing an enemy willing to die deliberately would test American resolve in ways conventional warfare had not. Yet even this desperate measure could not reverse the fundamental material and organizational advantages demonstrated at Leyte. The Leyte massacre's impact extended beyond military calculations into the political sphere. Reports of the one-sided victory reached civilian leaders in both nations, shaping their strategic thinking. In Washington, the demonstration of decisive air superiority reinforced the
Germany first strategy. If Japan's Air Force could be so thoroughly dominated, perhaps fewer resources would be needed in the Pacific than previously estimated. In Tokyo, the disaster forced a fundamental reassessment. The Imperial Conference of December 1944 featured unusually frank discussions about Japan's deteriorating military position. Admiral Kushiro Oikawa bluntly stated, "Our naval and air forces can no longer contest American control of the Western Pacific. We must consider what this means for our negotiating position." This political reassessment would evolve into the divisive internal debates about seeking peace terms versus fighting to the bitter end.
The Leyte massacre had made Japan's military weakness undeniable to its leadership, even as propaganda continued to promise ultimate victory to the public. For American pilots like Major Harrington, the political implications mattered less than the immediate tactical reality. Her focus remained on protecting American lives through air supremacy. In a letter to her sister in December 1944, she wrote, "What we're doing here is shortening this war. Every Japanese plane we destroy is one less threat to our ships and soldiers. Every day we control these skies brings peace one day closer." This pragmatic focus characterized American operations throughout the Philippines campaign. While Japanese forces increasingly embraced sacrifice for its own sake, American forces remained focused on concrete military objectives. This fundamental difference in approach, practical versus spiritual, systematic versus heroic, would define the war's final stages. The American approach extended to how leaders like Major Harrington treated their pilots. Rather than demanding sacrifice, she focused on preserving her force while maximizing combat effectiveness. Rotation schedules ensured pilots received adequate rest. Training continued even in the combat zone. Mechanical issues were addressed immediately rather than forcing pilots to fly compromised aircraft. Captain Sarah Williams, one of Harrington's squadron leaders, recalled, "The Major had a system for everything. Sleep schedules, maintenance procedures, even how we approached combat. She would tell us, 'I don't need heroes. I need professionals who come back alive to fly again tomorrow.'" That approach saved countless lives. This focus on sustainability stood in stark contrast to Japanese practices, which increasingly treated pilots as expendable resources. As their training programs collapsed and experienced pilots became rarities, Japanese commands were forced to accept casualties they would have considered unconscionable earlier in the war. The human cost of this disparity manifested in the lives of pilots on both sides. American pilots like Lieutenant Emma Clark could expect to complete their combat tours and return home. Japanese pilots increasingly flew with the expectation of death, either in conventional combat or, increasingly, in deliberate suicide attacks. This psychological burden affected combat performance in ways tactical analysis often overlooked. American pilots fought with the knowledge that survival was not just possible, but expected. Japanese pilots increasingly fought with the fatalism of men who expected to die. This difference in psychological approach translated into tactical aggression on the American side and increasingly desperate fatalism on the Japanese side. Major Harrington recognized this psychological element and incorporated it into her leadership approach. "Our advantage isn't just in our aircraft or training," she told her officers. "It's in our perspective. We fight to win and live. That clarity of purpose gives us an edge no technology can match."
Enjoyed. The lessons of the Leyte massacre rippled throughout the American Air Forces in the Pacific. Major Harrington's tactics and leadership approaches were documented, distributed, and adopted across fighter groups. The Harrington method of high-low attack coordination became standard doctrine for bomber interceptions. Her maintenance protocols were implemented throughout the 5th Air Force. By early 1945, her influence extended beyond her own squadrons. Summoned to brief senior leaders, including Generals Kenney and MacArthur, she provided candid assessments of Japanese capabilities and American opportunities. Her practical approach and engineering background made her evaluations particularly valuable to commanders planning the final stages of the Pacific Campaign. "The Japanese Air Force we face now is not the force that attacked Pearl Harbor," she told the assembled generals. "Their equipment is increasingly obsolete, their pilots inadequately trained, and their logistics system collapsing. What makes them dangerous is their desperation and willingness to sacrifice. Our challenge is not their capability, but their fatalism." This assessment proved accurate as the war moved toward the Japanese home islands. Conventional Japanese air power had been broken at Leyte and other engagements. What remained was an increasingly desperate force willing to embrace tactics conventional military doctrine considered unthinkable. The Leyte massacre stood as a watershed moment in aerial warfare. In approximately 20 minutes on November 12, 1944, American fighters destroyed or damaged between 71 and 113 Japanese aircraft. The exact number matters less than the psychological impact. The Japanese air capability in the Philippines was shattered, contributing directly to the success of American ground operations on Leyte and later Luzon. More significantly, Leyte demonstrated American military doctrine's effectiveness. The systematic approach to training, the emphasis on technological superiority, the integration of intelligence into operations, and the industrial capacity to sustain combat operations had produced tactical dominance. Young Americans, dismissed by Japanese militarist ideology as products of a weak democracy, had proved themselves lethal warriors. Major Olivia Harrington embodied this new kind of warfare. College-educated, technically proficient, and systematically methodical, she represented a leadership model as removed from samurai traditions as the P-51 was from the Zero. Her success demonstrated that modern warfare rewarded organizational efficiency and technological application more than individual heroism or spiritual strength. For military professionals, Leyte remains a case study in the effective application of air power. Intelligent superiority enabled tactical surprise. Technological advantages were systematically exploited. Superior training proved decisive, and industrial capacity translated directly into combat effectiveness. These principles, demonstrated so clearly over Leyte Gulf, would define air warfare for generations. The Japanese pilots who took off that November afternoon expected difficult combat. Their experience and courage gave them confidence, despite increasingly unfavorable conditions. Within 20 minutes, that confidence was shattered, along with their aircraft. The Americans had not just won a tactical victory, they had demonstrated a new form of warfare that would dominate the remainder of the century. The Leyte massacre was brief, approximately 20 minutes of intense combat. But in those 20 minutes, the nature of air warfare changed forever in the Pacific theater. The age of individual warrior heroes was ending. The age of systematic technological air power had arrived. The Japanese, who couldn't believe what had happened, were right to be shocked. They had witnessed not just their own defeat, but the birth of American air supremacy that would reshape the world. In the end, the Leyte massacre proved a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Victory belongs not to the bravest or most experienced, but to those who can most effectively combine intelligence, technology, training, and industrial capacity into overwhelming combat power. On November 12, 1944, over the beautiful blue waters of Leyte Gulf, American fighters demonstrated this truth with devastating clarity. The Japanese could not believe it, but belief was irrelevant. The planes were destroyed, the men were dead, and the war's outcome was increasingly certain. Major Harrington understood this reality more clearly than most. Air power isn't about individual dogfights anymore, she told a war correspondent after the battle. It's about systems confronting systems. The better system won today and will win this war. Her assessment proved accurate as American air power systematically dismantled Japanese military capabilities over the coming months. The legacy of those 20 minutes over Leyte continues to influence military thinking. Air forces worldwide study the engagement, learning lessons about the importance of air superiority, the vulnerability of conventional tactics against technological superiority, and the decisive impact of training and organization in modern warfare. The Leyte massacre was not just a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of how wars would be fought and won in the modern age. Major Harrington would continue leading her group through the Philippines campaign and the early stages of the Japan bombing offensive.
Her innovations in tactics and organization would influence American air doctrine long after the war ended. In 1985, 41 years after the Leyte massacre, an elderly Major General Olivia Harrington, retired, would meet former Lieutenant Akira Tanaka at an international conference on Pacific War history. Their conversation, recorded by historians, revealed how completely both understood the significance of what had happened over Leyte Gulf. "We never had a chance, did we?" Tanaka asked. "Not after your naval aviation losses in 1942, Harrington replied. "You built a magnificent force for 1941, but couldn't replace its losses. We built a system that got stronger every month." "The politicians should have recognized this reality sooner," Tanaka said. "Many lives might have been saved." Harrington nodded. "That's the final lesson of Leyte. Military reality eventually overcomes political fantasy. The sooner leaders accept this, the fewer people die unnecessarily." Their handshake, captured in a famous photograph, symbolized reconciliation between former enemies who understood the true nature of modern warfare better than most. The Leyte massacre had shown both of them, in different ways, that the age of the individual warrior hero had given way to the age of systems, organizations, and industries. For young military professionals studying air power, the Leyte massacre remains a textbook example of air superiority operations. Its lessons, intelligence dominance, technological advantage, superior training, and systematic exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities remain relevant in an age of stealth aircraft, precision munitions, and unmanned systems. The names and technologies change, but the principles demonstrated over Leyte Gulf endure.
Messages to Churchill, arguing that broad front approach has squandered opportunity for decisive victory. She publicly described American operations as supporting efforts to her 21st Army Group's main thrust. She rejected coordination mechanisms Eisenhower established to improve Allied cooperation, insisting on direct access that bypassed formal command structure. The behavior reflected Montgomery's fundamental inability to accept Britain's changed position within alliance. American forces now comprised over 60% of Allied troops in Europe. American production sustained operations through overwhelming logistical superiority. American strategic bombing had shattered German industrial capacity. Yet, Montgomery continued behaving as though British wisdom must guide American strength, creating contradiction that undermined coalition effectiveness at critical juncture. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. At dawn, German forces launched their last great offensive in West, attacking through Ardennes in desperate gamble to split Allied armies and seize Port of Antwerp. The assault achieved complete surprise, smashing into thinly held American positions and creating bulge in Allied lines that would give battle its name. For 10 days, outcome hung in balance as German spearheads drove toward Meuse River, threatening to fracture Allied defenses and prolong war indefinitely. The Battle of the Bulge became Montgomery's finest and worst moment simultaneously. Her military performance was exemplary. When Eisenhower transferred command of American 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery on December 20th, she immediately imposed order on confused defensive operations. She positioned British reserves to defend Meuse crossings. She coordinated American counterattacks. She demonstrated under genuine crisis conditions why Britain valued her leadership despite her personality. But Montgomery's conduct after battle sowed bitterness that would persist decades after war. On January 7, 1945, with German forces in full retreat and Allied victory assured, Montgomery held a press conference ostensibly to praise American troops and defend Eisenhower. What emerged instead was masterclass in self-promotion disguised as gracious compliment. Montgomery began by praising American soldiers' fighting qualities, but she quickly pivoted to describing her own actions upon taking command, actions presented as decisive interventions that saved American forces from disaster. "As soon as I saw what was happening," Montgomery explained, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river." She continued, describing how she had tidied up the battlefield, how she had thought ahead, how she had ensured balanced dispositions.
The battle, Montgomery concluded, had been most interesting, possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled. Throughout recitation, British actions were highlighted, Montgomery's brilliance emphasized, and American commanders conspicuously absent from the narrative. The performance was calculated insult disguised as compliment. Montgomery praised American soldiers while implying they had been saved by her superior leadership. She credited American courage while suggesting that American commanders had been overwhelmed by events until British professionalism imposed order. British reaction to press conference divided government against military and military against itself. Churchill, recognizing diplomatic disaster Montgomery had created, immediately attempted damage control through parliamentary statement emphasizing American contribution and characterizing Montgomery's role as supportive rather than decisive. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, despite private agreement with Montgomery's military assessment, publicly distanced himself from her presentation, emphasizing coalition nature of victory. Within British Army, reaction reflected deeper institutional divisions Montgomery had created during years of polarizing leadership. Supporters defended her account as factually accurate, arguing that Montgomery had indeed imposed necessary
order on confused situation. Critics viewed press conference as final evidence that Montgomery's personality had become strategic liability, regardless of her tactical competence. Most significantly, growing faction within British military leadership concluded that Montgomery had become net negative to Britain's strategic position regardless of her battlefield achievements. Her alienation of American allies threatened resource flow Britain desperately needed. Her public statements undermined diplomatic relationships essential to post-war reconstruction. Her command style prevented effective delegation necessary for modern coalition warfare. Major General Sir Francis de Guingand, Montgomery's long-suffering chief of staff, captured this assessment in memorandums submitted to War Office following Ardennes crisis. Field Marshal Montgomery's operational judgment remains valuable asset, but her inability to function within coalition framework has become existential threat to British strategic position. Each tactical success she delivers is offset by strategic damage her conduct creates. The mathematics of this exchange grow increasingly unfavorable as American predominance within alliance increases. The evaluation represented fundamental shift in British institutional assessment. Montgomery had transformed from indispensable commander who delivered victories when Britain desperately needed them into problematic figure whose contributions no longer justified disruption she created. This realization came too late to affect remaining European operations. By early 1945, military outcome had been determined by overwhelming Allied material superiority. Germany's defeat was inevitable regardless of command arrangements. But recognition that Montgomery had become liability rather than asset shaped post-war British military development profoundly. Command selection criteria shifted to emphasize coalition compatibility alongside tactical competence. Training programs incorporated lessons about necessity of genuine partnership rather than disguised supremacy. Strategic planning acknowledged the reality that Britain's position required cooperation rather than domination. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. European war ended with Allied victory that vindicated sacrifices made across 6 years of global conflict. In the euphoria of peace, old conflicts temporarily submerged. Montgomery received accolades from grateful British public. Churchill's government celebrated victory while preparing for uncertain post-war world. The moment belonged to collective achievement rather than individual claims. But beneath surface celebration, British military had reached conclusions about Montgomery that would shape institutional memory for generations. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been a brilliant tactician who delivered victories when Britain desperately needed them. She had also been a profoundly flawed leader whose personality created unnecessary obstacles to ultimate objective her tactical brilliance served. The final assessment belonged to Churchill, writing years after war in memoirs that balanced historical accuracy against political necessity. Montgomery possessed military talents that changed history at Britain's darkest hour. Her victory at El Alamein marked a genuine turning point in our fortunes. but her inability to adapt to coalition warfare nearly undermined the very cause her battlefield skills advanced. In war, personality affects effectiveness as profoundly as tactics or strategy. Montgomery never fully understood this essential truth. It was perhaps most devastating critique possible, not that Montgomery lacked military competence, but that her virtues were overwhelmed by vices that undermined the very cause she served. In coalition warfare, where personality affects effectiveness as profoundly as tactics or strategy, Montgomery's incapacity for treating allies as partners made her not merely difficult, but dangerous. The British learned this lesson through bitter experience. From North African sand to German mud, they discovered that military alliance requires more than shared enemies. It demands mutual respect, acknowledgement of partners' contributions, and willingness to subordinate ego to collective purpose. Montgomery, whatever her other qualities, could not meet these requirements, and in that failure lay answer to why the British came to hate Montgomery. Not because she lost battles, but because she made victory more difficult to achieve. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.